Hey everyone, and welcome back to my Kaalia of the Vast deck tech. This is part 2, where I'll go over each individual card, tell you why it's in my deck, and how it interacts with the other cards in the deck and the overall win condition. So without further ado, let's get to my commander. My commander is Kaalia of the Vast. Most of you know who she is, what she does. For those of you that may not, she's a 4-cost 2/2 flyer. When she attacks an opponent, you may put an Angel, Demon, or Dragon creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking that opponent. So basically, this deck, like most other Kaalia of the Vast decks, I would imagine, abuse that ability. Most of the creatures in your deck are going to be Angels, Demons, or Dragons. That's pretty much exactly what this deck aims to do, is to cheat out big, nasty creatures with her. And yeah, so Kaalia of the Vast, that's my commander. Just to show off my little alternate art Kaalia cards that Derek actually made for me. There's an actual, magic card promo version of it, and a nice little foil version of that. Okay, so first we'll go over the creatures in the deck. Obviously I play Angels, Demons, and Dragons, so let's do the Dragons first. First we have Forgestoker Dragon. He's a 6-cost 5/4 flyer, which allows you to pay 2, and he'll deal 1 damage to target creature. That creature can't block this combat. Activate this ability only if Forgestoker Dragon is attacking. He's pretty good if your opponent has other flyers on the board that could potentially block your flyers. So you can use this ability to pay 2, deal a damage to it, and make it so that it can't block. He can only do that while he's attacking, but generally that really doesn't matter. You usually want to be attacking with your big nasty creatures to begin with, so I think he's a pretty good fit for the deck. He can potentially remove small creatures, or just make it so that big creatures can't block your creatures. Next we have Hoard-Smelter Dragon. He's a 6-cost 5/5 flyer, which allows you to pay 3 colorless and a red to destroy target artifact. And then once you do that, the dragon gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the artifact's converted mana cost. So he's mainly in here for pesky artifact removal. 4 is pretty good to blow up an artifact, but he also gets that much bigger off of whatever the mana cost of the artifact that you blew up. So he can potentially get pretty big if you blow up high casting cost artifacts and whatnot. Next we have Balefire Dragon. He's a 7-cost 6/6 flyer. When he deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. So he's essentially a board wipe if he hits your opponent. Not many creatures are going to survive 6 damage, so especially you can potentially make this more. I do run Bladewing the Risen in this deck, and he has the ability to pump all your dragons +1/+1 for a black and a red. So you can get up to 6, 7, 8 damage, and not many creatures on your opponent's side of the board are going to survive that unless they have indestructible. So he's essentially a one-sided board wipe if he hits your opponent. Next we have Thundermaw Hellkite. He's a 5-cost 5/5 flyer with haste. When he enters the battlefield, he deals 1 damage to each creature with flying your opponent's control. Tap those creatures. He's basically a better version of Forgestoker Dragon. He costs less to play. He has haste, which is nice. He can, if you hard cast him, you can attack in the same turn with him. Generally, you're probably going to be cheating him out with Kaalia, but again, if your opponents have flyers on the board that could stop your flyers from getting through to damage to your opponent, this guy's a really good card. He'll tap all those flyers and make it so that you can just swing away. Next we have Bogardan Hellkite, 8-cost 5/5 flyer with flash, which is pretty nice. Generally the flash isn't going to matter too much because, again, Kaalia of the Vast, you're going to be cheating creatures out of your hand. But what's nice about him is that when he enters the battlefield, he deals 5 damage, divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or players. He works really well with one of the Angels that I have in the deck, but I'll get to that interaction once I get to the Angel. Next we have Kokusho the Evening Star, 6-cost 5/5 flyer. Everybody knows what this guy does. When he dies, each opponent loses 5 life and you gain that much life. He was previously banned in EDH. Once they unbanned him, he pretty much went straight into this deck. Next we have Rimescale Dragon. He's a 7-cost 5/5 flyer. This creature is the sole reason why I run snow-covered basic lands in this deck, for his ability where you can pay 2 colorless and a snow mana to tap target creature and put an ice counter on it. Creatures with ice counters on them don't untap during their controller's untap step. So basically he permanently locks down any creature that you use his ability on, puts an ice counter on it, and it makes it so that creature becomes tapped and it never untaps as long as it has an ice counter on it. So he's pretty nice, if you want to lock out a creature, any specific creature that maybe has like a tap ability or something that you don't want to attack you, he's really, really good. Next we have Steel Hellkite, 6-cost 5/5 flyer. You can pay 2 colorless to give him a +1/+0 until end of turn. I mean, that's okay. Most of the time his second ability is what I'm going to activate, where you can pay X to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X, whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. You can only activate that ability once per turn, but if your opponents have, some pesky things on the board, maybe with the same mana cost, you can activate that ability for, if you activate it for 3, he blows up all non-land permanents they control that cost 3. So he can potentially be, removal for some of your opponent's creatures, artifacts, enchantments, whatever it may be, whatever you pay for X. Next we have Scourge of Kerr Ridges. He's an 8-cost 6/6 flyer. You can pay 2 to Pyroclasm, basically. 2 damage to each creature without flying. 99% of the creatures in this deck have flying, so that ability is probably never going to touch any of your creatures, but his second ability allows you to pay 6 and he deals 6 damage to each other creature with flying. So if he's your sole flyer on the board, he can potentially wipe out your opponent's flyers. Generally, I don't activate that ability too much. It's more than likely always going to be the Pyroclasm-ish ability. So, he's a really good card. Here we have Bladewing the Risen. 7-cost 4/4 flyer. When he comes into play, you may return target dragon permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So he reses a dragon that's in your graveyard, and he has the ability to pay a black and a red to pump all your dragons +1/+1 until end of turn. So he's pretty nice. Cheat him out with Kaalia, hit for 4, res another dragon, maybe a Bogardan Hellkite, deal 5 more damage. Probably the best case scenario, but he's a good fit for the deck. He's a dragon, he pumps all your other dragons, and he reses a dragon if one's in your graveyard. And lastly, we have Yosei the Morningstar. Excuse me. 6-cost 5/5 flyer. When he dies, target player skips his or her next untap step, and you get to tap up to 5 target permanents that player controls. So you can essentially kind of shut a player out for a turn with this card if he dies. If your opponent has creatures that you want to tap down so they can't attack you, or other permanents, maybe things with tap abilities that you don't want them to use on their next turn, he is really good for that. So they skip their untap and you get to tap 5 things that they control. Okay, that's it for the dragons. Next we'll go to the angels. First up we have Karmic Guide. It's a 5-cost 2/2 flyer with Prot Black and Echo. For those of you who don't know what Echo is, basically when you cast this during your next upkeep, you have to pay this card's casting cost or it's sacrificed. Generally, you're never going to play the Echo cost on this unless you desperately need a 2/2 flyer with protection from black. But mainly this is in here so that when it comes into play, choose target creature card in your graveyard and put that creature into play. So it's essentially a res spell. You can cheat this out with Kaalia, and then res another creature card from your graveyard. Kind of similar to Bladewing, but it doesn't just target dragons, it targets anything. Next we have Deathless Angel, 6-cost 5/7 flyer. You can pay 2 white to make target creature indestructible this turn. This card's really good, I think. It's not as good as, let's say, like Avacyn, but, if you don't have an Avacyn on the board, this is a good kind of like second go-to card for that. You know, granted that you have the double white to make something indestructible, but, you know, making something indestructible in EDH is pretty relevant. Next we have Iona, Shield of Emeria. She's a 9-cost 7/7 flyer. You know, a lot of you probably know what she does, but, you know, when she enters the battlefield, you choose a color, and then your opponents can't cast spells of the chosen color. So I'm not going to deny that this card is really, really good. Generally, I'm wary about when I play it. You know, if an opponent is playing a monocolored deck, just to not be super, super mean, I'm probably not going to cast this card. But, you know, if your opponent's playing dual color, maybe even tricolor, you know, this is a really good card. It can shut out some of the cards that they'd be able to cast. So, you know, this is a really, really good card. Not going to deny it. But generally, you know, depending on my mood, I guess, you know, I might hold this card back just to avoid, you know, someone not being able to have fun by not being able to cast their cards. Next we have Angel of Despair. It's a 7-cost 5/5 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target permanent. You know, pretty self-explanatory. You know, you cheat this out with Kaalia, it's going to hit for 5, and it gets to blow anything up. Just target permanent, destroy anything. Next we have Angel of Serenity. It is a 7-cost 5/6 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile up to 3 other target creatures from the battlefield and/or creature cards from graveyards. So that's pretty good. You know, you can exile some of your opponent's creatures off the board to get them out of the way to, you know, swing away with your creatures. You can potentially use this on yourself. If you have creatures in your graveyard, you know, you can exile them, and then if the second ability triggers, whenever Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield, return the exile cards to their owner's hands. So if you target, you know, maybe some of your creatures in your graveyard, you know, if you have a way for this card to leave play, those creature cards are going to go back to your hand, and then you can just get more value out of them by attacking with Kaalia and cheating them out from your hand again. You can also target your opponent's creatures in their graveyard if you know, if they're playing maybe like a Reanimator deck or something that abuses the graveyard. You know, this would be pretty decent for that. The only thing is, when she leaves play, the cards go back to your opponent's hand. Generally, if I'm going to exile cards from a graveyard, it's going to be my own. Next we have Rhea Dawnbringer, 9-cost 4/6 flyer. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to play. So, you know, kind of like a Debtor's Knell, just for your graveyard. But, you know, she's pretty good. Cheat her out with Kaalia, she'll hit for 4, and she'll res a creature out of your graveyard every upkeep. Next we have Avacyn, Angel of Hope, probably the best card in the deck. Everybody knows what this does. You know, she's an 8-cost 8/8 flyer with Vigilance, which makes herself and all other permanents you control indestructible. So generally, when you drop this card on the board, you're probably going to win the game relatively soon. Next we have Linvala, Keeper of Silence. She's a 4-cost 3/4 flyer. Activated abilities of creatures your opponents control can't be activated. So she's a pretty good shutout card if your opponents are playing a lot of creatures that have activated abilities. Just off the top of my head, I could think of like Kiki Jiki. You know, he's pretty annoying if you're playing against him. So, you know, this card would shut something like that out. It would shut out any creature that has an activated ability and make it so your opponents can't use that ability. Next we have Aurelia, the Warleader. She's a 6-cost 3/4 flyer with Vigilance and Haste. And when she attacks for the first time each turn, you get to untap all creatures you control, and then after that combat phase, there is an additional combat phase. So, if you cheat her out with Kaalia, she doesn't trigger that ability, because she physically has to attack by you declaring your attack step and turning her sideways. But, you know, being able to get an additional combat phase out of a creature is pretty nice, especially in this kind of deck with all the big, mean creatures that you're going to be playing. Generally, when you get an additional combat phase, you're more than likely probably going to kill somebody in that turn. And lastly, for the Angels, we have Gisela, Blade of Goldnight. She is a 7-cost 5/5 flyer with First Strike. which reads, if a source would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, that source deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. So she's kind of like a Furnace of Wrath, I suppose. But her second ability is, if a source would deal damage to you or a permanent you control, prevent half that damage, rounded up. So she halves all the damage that you and your permanents take, and she doubles all the damage that your opponents and their permanents take. This is the Angel that I was speaking of that is particularly good with Bogardan Hellkite. See if I can find him here. So, you know, if you have Gisela on the board and then you cheat out a Bogardan Hellkite, generally what I do is this gets cheated out with Kaalia. If this is already on the board, the 5 damage gets doubled to 10 damage, which is probably going to go straight to your opponent's face, and then when this hits your opponent, it's going to deal 10 more damage. So that's 20 damage right there just off of these 2 cards. You know, probably when you played this, or if you cheated out with Kaalia, you know, she's going to hit for 10 because she's going to double the damage that she deals to your opponent. So that's 10 damage right there. Next turn you cheat this out, 10 damage to your opponent's face, then 10 more damage when it hits, that's 30 damage. That's 3/4 your opponent's life total. So that's, you know, a pretty good little 2-card combo, I guess, that will deal a ton of damage to your opponent. Okay, lastly for the creatures, we'll go to the demons. First off, we have Sire of Insanity. I believe he is one of the 2 creatures that I have in the deck that don't fly. But he's pretty good. He's a 6-cost 6/4. At the beginning of each end step, each player discards his or her hand. So generally I like to drop this guy when I have when I've established a good board presence. And then I'll drop this guy, and then at the end of everybody's turn they have to dump their hand into their graveyard. So this gives your opponent a lot less options to do to deal with the menacing creatures that you're pumping out with your general. So essentially, if your opponent doesn't play whatever they draw on their next turns, it's just going to go into their graveyard. Next we have Rune-Scarred Demon, basically a demonic tutor on a 6/6 flying body. You know, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's basically what he does. You drop him, he tutors you up a card to your hand, and he's a 6/6 flyer, so, you know, pretty self-explanatory, good fit for this deck. Next we have Shadowborn Demon. He's a 5-cost 5/6 flyer. When he enters the battlefield, destroy target non-demon creature, so that's pretty good. You know, you don't generally see too many demons being played in EDH unless you're playing against a Kaalia deck maybe. But, you know, he gives you the ability to blow up a creature, any creature that's not a demon. The only drawback is at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are fewer than 6 creature cards in your graveyard, you sacrifice a creature. So, you know, sometimes that may not matter. If you have creatures to sacrifice, you know, you could do that. Generally, I'll probably try dropping this guy or cheating him out when I do meet that second ability of that many creatures in my graveyard, just so I don't have to sacrifice anything. But, you know, you either cast him for 5 and blow up a creature and swing for 5, or cheat him out for nothing, blow up a creature and swing for 5. Next we have Rakdos the Defiler. 6-cost 7/6 flyer with trample. When he attacks, you have to sacrifice half the non-demon permanents you control rounded up. Then whenever he deals combat damage to a player, that player sacrifices half the non-demon permanents he or she controls rounded up. He's really good in this deck, especially if you cheat him out with Kaalia. Actually, that's really the only way he is good in the deck. Because if you cheat him out with Kaalia and put him into play tapped and attacking, it skips his first ability. So it makes it so that you don't have to sacrifice anything, because he's not physically being declared as an attacker during your combat phase and then being turned sideways. He's just being put into play tapped and attacking. So that kind of skips over that first ability, and then when he hits your opponent, they sacrifice half their stuff, half their non-demon stuff, rounded up. So, you know, if he hits your opponent, it's going to hurt a lot. So, you know, if you have a way to get this guy back to your hand somehow, you know, and keep reusing him, he's really, really good in this deck. Next we have the second version of Rakdos. Rakdos, Lord of Riots. He's a 4-cost 6/6 that cannot be cast unless an opponent lost life this turn. He has flying and trample. And then creature spells you cast cost 1 colorless less to cast for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So he's really good in this deck. You know, again, you're probably going to be cheating him out with your general, so you don't have to worry about actually casting him and meeting that, you know, that restriction of your opponent losing life in that turn. So, you know, you're going to cheat him out. He's going to hit for 6. And then creature spells you cast cost 1 colorless less to cast for each 1 life your opponents have lost. So you hit with this guy for 6, he's going to make it so all your creatures cost 6 colorless less. So he's pretty good. You know, if you cheat him out and then you have other creatures in your hand that you could now play for really, really cheap, he will just let you establish an even heavier board presence when he hits, because he'll make your stuff cost cheaper. Next we have Pestilence Demon. He is a 8 cost 7/6 flyer, where you can pay 1 black to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. So he's essentially the enchantment Pestilence on a huge nasty creature. So, you know, if you really need to damage, you know, maybe you have an opponent that's at low life, you can damage them out with this to get them out of the game. If someone's playing a token deck, pay a black and essentially, you know, nuke their board of 1/1s. So, I mean, I think he's a pretty good fit for this deck. He hits for a high amount of damage, and, you know, he can deal damage to everybody. Next we have Lord of the Void. He's a 7/7 flyer. When he deals combat damage to a player, you exile the top 7 cards of that player's library, then put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield under your control. So he's really good. He lets you steal creatures from your opponent's library if he hits. It also exiles all the other cards that you basically take off your opponent's deck. So, you know, you take a creature, then the rest of the cards are exiled, and your opponent can't use them ever again. Next we have Extractor Demon. He's a 6 cost 5/5 flyer. Whenever another creature leaves play, you may have target player put the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. I think he's a really good fit for this deck. You know, he's a demon. He hits for 5. You know, and every time another creature leaves the battlefield, somebody's going to mill the top of their deck for 2. So, you know, you could potentially mill somebody out with this guy if lots of creatures start dying. But, you know, overall, I think he's a good fit for the deck. Next we have Harvester of Souls. 6 cost 5/5 with Death Touch. He's another creature that doesn't fly. One of the few in the deck. But whenever another non-token creature dies, you may draw a card. So, I mean, I feel like this guy should probably be played in almost every deck that runs black. I mean, he's just pure card advantage if somebody does a board wipe, or maybe someone has a Grave Pact on the board and creatures start dying, you're going to start drawing a lot of cards with this guy. And lastly, we have Bloodgift Demon. He's a 5 cost 5/4 flyer. He's kind of like a Phyrexian Arena on a body. You know, at the beginning of your upkeep, target player draws a card and loses 1 life. You can target other people with this. You don't have to target yourself because it says target player. So, you know, if someone's really low life, you know, they're sitting at like 1 or 2 life, you can potentially, you know, get them out of the game with this guy by making them draw cards. But generally, you're probably going to target yourself for the card advantage. Okay, so that is the creature base of the deck. Next, we will go into the... Actually, wait. I have one other creature in this deck that is not an Angel, Demon, or a Dragon, and that creature is Grand Abolisher. He's a 2 cost 2/2. During your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. So it basically makes it so your opponents can't stop your onslaught on your turn when you're attacking with huge, nasty creatures. Okay, so that's the end of the creature base. Next we will go into the artifacts and enchantments of the deck. First up are the equipments I run. Darksteel Plate. Everybody knows what this does. 3 costs equipment, costs 2 to equip. It itself is indestructible, and when you equip it to a creature, that creature becomes indestructible. Pretty self-explanatory. Next we have Lightning Greaves, another card, you know, that's very well known. Costs 2, costs 0 to equip, and the equipped creature has Haste and Shroud. You know, if you drop this on turn 2 and then drop Kaalia on turn 4, equip this to her for 0, you can swing with her in that same turn. And lastly, for the equipments, I run Nim Deathmantle. I think this is a really underrated card. Costs 2 to play, 4 colorless to equip, but generally I'm never really going to equip it to anything. But it does give the equipped creature +2/+2, gives it Intimidate, and it is a black zombie. But the second part is the most relevant. Whenever a non-token creature is put in your graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 4 colorless. If you do, return that card to the battlefield and attach Nim Deathmantle to it. So generally I'll play this, let it sit there. If one of my creatures dies and I want to get it back, I can pay 4, get it back from my graveyard, and attach this to it. So it's a pretty good form of recursion. Next we have the mana rocks that I play. Chromatic Lantern. I think this is a really, really good mana rock. Basically makes it so all your lands tap for any color, so it's really good mana fixing. And itself will tap for 1 mana of any color. So very solid mana rock. Next I run all the signets. Here's Orzhov's Signet. Everybody knows what these do. They cost 2 to play, 1 colorless, and tap it to get a color of that guild. Each color of that guild's color. So Orzhov's Signet, you pay 1, tap it, you get white and black. Rakdos, you pay 1 and tap it, you get a red and a black. And Boros Signet, pay 1, tap it, get a red and a white. For the rest of the artifacts and enchantments, here we have Strionic Resonator. This card is a beast card in this deck. It costs 2 to play, and then you can pay 2 and tap it to copy target triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. This will copy Kaalia's ability when she attacks, of you being able to take a creature card, an Angel, Demon, or Dragon from your hand and put it into play tapped and attacking. So if you attack with her, you pump out a creature with her, you can pay 2 and tap this to do it again. Essentially copy that ability, and you're putting out 2 creatures into play tapped and attacking. There are many, many, many other interactions with this card in this deck. Just one, for example, Bogardan Hellkite. When he enters the battlefield, he deals the 5 damage. So if you play him or cheat him out with Kaalia, pay 2, tap this, deal another 5 damage. And if you have Gisela on the board, that's, a ridiculous amount of damage. Next we have Mimic Vat, costs 3, it's an artifact. Whenever a non-token creature is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may exile that card. If you do, return each other card exile with Mimic Vat to its owner's graveyard. So if you imprint something with this and then you change your mind, you want to imprint this with something else, another creature that hits a graveyard, the creature that was previously exiled goes back to your owner's graveyard. But you can pay 3 and tap it to put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of the exiled card. It gains haste. Exile at the beginning of the next end step. So, you could potentially use this on your general. Kaalia, if she gets killed, which she generally does a lot when I play my Kaalia deck. She gets really high up there with the general, the extra general cost of 2 colorless every time you cast her from the command zone. So sometimes if she gets really high up there, I'll just let her sit in the graveyard, or I'll let her hit the graveyard rather, imprint her onto this, and then just pay 3 and tap this to get a Kaalia every turn. You can also use this on your opponent's creatures if a really, really good creature of theirs hits the graveyard. You can exile it, put it on this, and then make copies of it. Next we have Grave Pact. I think this is a black staple enchantment. It's, costs 4. Whenever a creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each other player sacrifices a creature. So essentially every time one of your creatures dies, all your opponents have to choose and sacrifice a creature. So, it may make your opponents think twice about killing one of your creatures if they don't want to lose any of theirs. Next we have Leyline of the Void. It costs 4. It's a black enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it in play, so that's pretty cool. But if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard, remove it from the game instead. So essentially this is a graveyard hate card. If your opponent is playing a deck that abuses the graveyard, this is a really good card for that, to deal with that. Next we have Gift of Immortality. It's a 3-cost white aura. It says, whenever enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Then you return Gift of Immortality to the battlefield attached to that creature at the beginning of the next end step. So essentially when you attach this to a creature, it basically has to be killed twice to actually really kill it. So if this is attached to it, your opponent kills it, it immediately comes back into play, and then this comes back onto it at your end step. Excuse me. So basically it makes it so that whatever creature has this on it has to be killed twice to really be killed. Next we have Warstorm Surge. It's 6 cost red enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to target creature or player. It's a really, really good enchantment for this deck. You drop this, you start cheating out big, nasty creatures with high power. They're going to deal that much damage right off the bat just by coming into play, and then you're going to swing with them and deal more damage. So this is a really good enchantment for this deck. Next we have Whip of Erebos. It's a 4-cost black legendary enchantment artifact, which gives all your creatures lifelink, which is pretty cool. But you can pay 4 and tap it to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Exile at the beginning of the next end step. If it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So it's essentially just a recursion card. If you really badly need a creature back from your graveyard, just have it be like a one and done that may win you the game. It's a really good card for that. Or, if you don't have any way to recur your creatures from the graveyard, you can use this to get them back one time, do some work with them, but, they get exiled after that. But I do like this card a lot. It's good recursion, and it gives all your creatures lifelink. So, that's always nice. With big, nasty creatures that you're going to be playing, they're going to gain you a lot of life. Next we have Sigil of the New Dawn. It's a 4-cost white enchantment that I think is a pretty underrated card. It's a really good card for this deck in particular. It reads, whenever a creature is put in your graveyard from play, you may pay a colorless and a white. If you do, return that card to your hand. So if you start cheating out creatures with your general, they get killed. If you have the mana available, you can pay 2 to get that creature card back to your hand instead of it going to your graveyard, and then use it again with Kaalia. So I think this is a really good card for this deck overall. And lastly, we have Hammer of Perforos. It's a 3-cost red enchantment artifact. Creatures you control have haste. Mainly this is in there just for that. It's basically a fervor, just with an added ability where you can pay 2 colorless and a red and tap it to sacrifice a land and get a 3/3 colorless golem. Generally, I'm never going to use that unless my opponent is targeting one of my lands to destroy, and then in response I could do that to at least get a creature out of it. But mostly this is just in here to give all my creatures haste. If you drop this on turn 3, drop Kaalia on turn 4, you can attack with her in the same turn. Okay, so that is it for the artifacts and enchantments. Next we'll go to the instants and sorceries of the deck. First we will look at my tutor package. First up is Diabolic Tutor. Everybody knows what this does. It costs 4, you fetch up a card from your deck and put it in your hand. Increasing Ambition, same thing, but it costs 5, but it also has Flashback. So if you flash it back, you get to search for 2 cards instead of 1 card. So this will get you 3 cards tutored out of your deck. Yeah, it costs 1 more than Diabolic Tutor, but, just the fact that it has Flashback, if it's late game and you need an answer to one of your opponent's cards on the board, you could flash this back from your graveyard and get 2 cards. That's pretty nice. Next we have Steel Shaper's Gift, basically a demonic tutor for equipments. Costs 1 white. You search your deck for an equipment card, reveal it, put it in your hand. If I need a Lightning Greaves, if I have this in my opening hand, turn 1, I could play this, fetch up a Lightning Greaves, turn 2, play the Lightning Greaves. You get the idea from there. And lastly, Demonic Tutor, costs 2, fetch up a card from your deck and put it in your hand. Okay, next we will go over the sweepers that I play in the deck. First up is In Garruk's Wake. It's basically Plague Wind with the added goodness of blowing up all your opponent's planeswalkers. It doesn't have the can't be regenerated clause on it like Plague Wind does, but I felt that I actually replaced Plague Wind with this card, You know, it costs the same amount of mana. It basically does the same thing, but it also blows up all planeswalkers you don't control. So I feel like that was a pretty good replacement over Plaguewind for this card. Next we have Damnation, Black Wrath of God. Basically, destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated. And lastly, Akroma's Vengeance, costs 6 to play. You destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So if you desperately need to wipe the board of everything but lands and planeswalkers, this will do that for you. But, you know, if you have it in your hand and you don't want to use it, you don't need to use it, you can cycle it for 3 colorless and get a card out of it. So that's pretty nice. Okay, next we'll go through the rest of the instants and sorceries I play. Here is Mortify, just spot removal for me. Destroy target creature or enchantment, you know, at instant speed, so that's pretty nice. You know, just good spot removal. Next up we have Dreadbore, kind of the same thing, except it costs black and red. It is sorcery speed, but you get to destroy target creature or a planeswalker, so more spot removal. Next up, we have I think one of the best white removal spells for artifacts or enchantments. Return to Dust. It costs 4. You exile target artifact or enchantment, but if you cast it during your main phase, you may exile up to 1 other target artifact or enchantment. So if you cast this during your main phase, you get to exile 2 artifacts or enchantments. So that's always pretty good. You know, if you're playing a multiplayer game and you know, each opponent has something pesky on the board that you want to get rid of, you cast this during your main phase, get rid of both of them. Why not? Here we have Savage Beating. It's a 5-cost red instant that you can only cast on your turn and only during combat. And then it allows you to choose one of the following. Creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn, or untap all creatures you control, and after this phase there's an additional combat phase. But right at the bottom we have the Entwine cost. So if you pay a colorless and a red in addition to the casting cost of this card, you get to choose both of those things. So if you Entwine this, you're probably going to win the game. Generally you want to hold this card for when you know if you cast this Entwined, you're going to win. Hell, even just giving creatures double strike could win you the game, or an additional combat phase can win you the game. So this is just a really good, well-rounded card for this deck. Sorry about that. Let's straighten the camera out there. Next we have Patriarch's Bidding. It's a 5-cost black sorcery. Each player chooses a creature type. Each player returns all creature cards of the type chosen this way from his or her graveyard to play. So this is a really good card for this deck. You know, with the 3 tribes that I play, Angels, Demons, and Dragons, you know, if I cast this card, I'm probably going to call whatever I have more of in my graveyard, unless I have some really good creatures of a particular tribe in my graveyard that I want back, you know, that could solidify me the win. I'll cast that, or this card, for one of those tribes. This is a really good card for any tribal deck that you're playing. The only drawback is each player gets to do so. So if your opponents are playing a tribal deck themselves, they're probably going to get a lot of things back from their graveyard too. But, you know, if you pick your moment right with this card, it can win you the game. And lastly, we have Earthquake. Costs 1 red and X, and it deals X damage to each creature without flying and each player. I've won games off of this card, actually, just from damaging people out with it. But it also deals X damage to each creature without flying. So the majority of my creatures in this deck, I think I said before there were only 2, but there's actually 3 creatures that I have that don't fly in this deck. But basically that's the majority of my creatures have flying. So this card will probably hardly ever hit any of my creatures and hit my opponent's creatures without flying. Okay, and lastly, couple of the lands that I play. They're like what I like to call my tech lands. First up we have Reliquary Tower. Taps for a colorless and you have no maximum hand size, so maybe if someone's forcing you to draw a bunch of cards, Or, you know, if you have a Harvester of Souls on the board or something like that, you know, and you're drawing a bunch of cards, you have this on the board, you don't have to discard any of them at the end of your turn by being over 7 cards, because you have no maximum hand size. Next up we have Vault of the Archangel. It taps for a colorless, or you can pay 2 colorless, a white and a black, and tap it to give creatures you control Death Touch and Lifelink. So that's really, really good. 4 mana to give your creatures 2 really solid abilities like that. Death Touch and Lifelink is really, really good, and it fits in the colors in this deck. So I think it's a good fit for this deck. Next we have Rogue's Passage. It taps for a colorless, or you can pay 4 and tap it to make target creature unblockable this turn. So if you have a creature that you need to get in with to deal damage, maybe it's Rakdos the Defiler. Actually, you probably wouldn't do that, because you generally don't want to attack with him to trigger his first ability. But, you know, if you need to get in with a creature, make it unblockable. If you need to get in for lethal, if your opponent has a flyer that can block your flyer, pay 4, tap this, make your creature unblockable, and go in for lethal. Next we have Mirror in the Moaning Well. It's a legendary land. You can tap it for a colorless, or you can pay 3 colorless and tap it to sacrifice a creature. You gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness. So, you know, if you want to use this maybe on Kokusho, you know, he'll die. You'll gain 5 life off of him having 5 toughness, and then he'll drain everybody for 5, and you gain that much more. Or if your opponent's trying to maybe steal one of your creatures, if they're playing blue, you know, you can use this in response to sacrifice it to gain some life, whatever it may be. You know, I think this is a good card for the deck. You know, just being able to have a sacrifice outlet to gain some life is pretty cool. And lastly, Bojuka Bog. If you're playing black, you should be playing this land. It exiles every card from target player's graveyard. So, you know, it's kind of like a land that I think is a staple. If you're playing black in any type of deck, you should be playing Bojuka Bog. Okay, so that is it for part 2 of my Kaalia of the Vast EDH deck tech. Basically, the win condition of this deck is to play this card right here and start attacking with it every turn and pumping out big, nasty creatures with it. This is a very well-known commander. It was one of the pre-cons from the original commander set. So a lot of people know what this does. A lot of people will be prepared for it if you're going to an event, maybe at a local gaming store, and you're playing this as your general. A lot of people are probably going to be ready for it. But it's a pretty fun deck to play. I mean, the only real drawback to her is she has to attack in order to cheat creatures out. So if your opponents have answers to that, maybe to respond to your combat phase and kill her, she will die a lot. She's a very menacing general. I've had games where she's gone up to over 20 to cast because she just gets hated off the board constantly. Because it's no joke to just be able to cheat out an angel, demon, or dragon from your hand, just because she attacked. So she's a very powerful general, but she's a very well-known general. So like I said, if you're going to be playing this card as your commander at a local gaming store in an event, be prepared to have people there be prepared for you to be playing this, basically. But it was my very first commander deck that I built. I love this deck. I love playing it. I've made very, very many changes to it over the years that I've had it. But yeah, so that is my Kaalia of the Vast EDH deck tech. Thanks for tuning into this video. Like, comment, subscribe. Anything that you think you would maybe take out of this deck that I have in it and replace it with something else, or any suggestions that you may have about the cards in my deck, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. But thanks guys for watching this video, and keep tuning into our channel for more deck tech videos and things of that nature. Thanks again.